Now let's backtrack a little, Maximilian. Right in the beginning of the speech, the Russian president made it clear that the military response is going to be taken step by step. I want to ask you, how are you assessing this? Does this show preparedness or does this show uncertainty?
I think it speaks to that long-term strategy he has. And one of the really important rhetorical changes from Putin's speech is that he's been referring throughout it to the conflict as a war. When he first launched this last year, it was a special military operation. Now he already began this language in December using the term war for the first time, even though the Russian press is banned from calling it that. But I think this is Putin's attempt to sort of justify it and prepare for that long-term strategy and intentionally to turn it into a waiting game of who's willing to be involved in this conflict at heavy cost for longer, Russia or the West.
All right. Now, we also cannot negate the timing of this speech. It comes just a day after U.S. President Joe Biden was seen strolling on the streets of Kiev. And now we know that Russia was informed about the visit, in fact, hours before the departure. Now, I want to ask you, how are you decoding the dynamics between United States and Russia amid a raging war that is going on right now?
Well, we're seeing this play out in a lot of other aspects of Russian-Western relations. Of course, the sanctions against Russia are one of the most wide-ranging sanctions regimes since World War II. The level of diplomacy is very low. We've seen issues and disputes around the existing and the ones that have survived so far. Nuclear disarmament treaties with the U.S. accusing Russia of violating them, and Russia in turn saying that it's not us violating them. It's the U.S. So, Russian and U.S. relations have not been this poor since the Cold War. And frankly, this speech and the West support for Ukraine both show that, there's no realistic prospect for recovery on that front anytime soon.
Absolutely. And now, picking on those points related to United States, the West per se and Russia, in the speech so far, the Russian president has been squarely blaming the United States and the NATO for what is happening in Ukraine. And we also hear a similar resentment coming in from the Western side. But the war has dragged on enough, won't you say, for a blame game to play out like this? I want to ask you, how do you see this impacting the peace process, if at all it exists at this point?
Well, there isn't really much of a peace process at this point because Russia refuses to negotiate anything that doesn't include Ukraine accepting its annexation of the Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. The first two of those are in Ukraine's east. The latter two are in the south. Now, the Russian forces have never controlled the majority of these territories. And of course, Ukraine doesn't even recognize its annexation of its Crimea region in 2014. So I do think we will, sadly not see major progress at the negotiating table anytime soon because both sides aren't even sat down at a table. The question is really, Putin has staked his entire presidency on this, and realistically, can he negotiate anything other than those demands? It may be that ultimately the conflict at some point ends without a formal peace process, but rather an effective dividing line. And the Ukrainians obviously want to push that back to the Russian border, or at least to the lines of control as they stood on the 24th of February last year, where Russia controlled just Crimea and around 40% of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions. I think that's, if not a peace settlement Ukraine can live with, it's a reality that they can live with, in part because the cost of repairing those areas and where Russian propaganda has been so dominant for the last 9 years is extremely high. But I don't think that it's realistic right now to talk about prognostications or predictions for a settlement because it's just not, there isn't even a table yet for it to be on, so it's not on the table.
I don't think Vladimir Putin agrees to your assessment that much because, in fact, just now he has just said we will do everything we can that peace settles once again in this land. That's what he has just said. But, you have a point because just moments back, this was the same Putin who said that we will continue to scale up program to support the region and up our military gains. So these are two very conflicting narratives coming in from Vladimir Putin because on one hand, you talk about peace process. On the other hand, you talk about scaling up your military acquisition. So how are you assessing this?
Sure. Well, Putin, if you listen to his recent declaration about plans for peace and then his earlier statements about the supposed Nazification of Ukraine, which is led by a Jewish president, a claim that's obviously complete nonsense. His view of peace is that peace can only be won on the battlefield by destroying the Ukrainian military, pushing Russia's borders into Ukraine and removing what he sees as the Ukrainian threat. I would, of course, argue that he is the actual threat here as the unilateral aggressor. I think the majority of the international community certainly agrees with that view. But Putin is talking about peace through his strength, not peace through negotiations. And for me, that we should read that as he will attack more to try to win peace rather than talk about peace to attack less.
Yeah, interesting point, because if you have a different version of peace altogether, a version that Putin is portraying and one that West sees or the world sees, how do you come on the same table, a table that you say doesn't even exist? But, since we talked about the military aspect of it, let's come on the counter-military aspect of it, which is the sanctions, which is something of a tool that the West has been using. It has been, even just yesterday, Joe Biden's visit to Kiev, he announced furthermore sanctions against Russia and anyone supporting the war from the Russian side. But how effective do you think sanctions actually work for a country like Russia? Because it's not the first time the West has imposed sanctions against Russia, or for that matter to Iran or the other countries, North Korea. But how effective do you think sanctions actually work for a war to end?
Well, so I think your question gets to the right point. We need to talk about what is the purpose of sanctions. And oftentimes people say, sanctions are meant to try to force Russia to stop the war by prioritizing the economy over it. But actually, I don't think that is the way that sanctions work. Sanctions are not a particularly effective deterrent, and they aren't effective at causing governments to change their agendas. We've seen that in countless examples from, Cuba, which has been under U.S. sanctions for 70-some years now, Iran, even South Africa. Before the end of apartheid. It wasn't, the sanctions that caused that, but rather domestic developments. But what sanctions really do is they attempt to weaken the state and to lower the state capacity of the affected state. So they go directly at Russia's ability to fight this war, to build up its military, and to attack potentially other neighbors as well. Of course, this is the second time Putin's launched a war against Ukraine. He launched a war against Georgia. Before that, in 2008, many Eastern European countries feel very much at risk of being Putin's next target. And the sanctions not only target the Russian economy more broadly, but specifically target its military and its ability to buy and to secure the kind of technology that it needs to keep its military as a modern fighting force. That being said, the real toughest sanctions come on Russia's central bank and effectively serve to cut it out of the international economic system. And this is where I think we'll see the long-term impact of these sanctions, because, as I said, the war looks like it's going to be going on for some time. Sanctions are also much harder to lift than they are to implement, because, you have to explain why you're lifting them. And without a Russian defeat, I think that would be a very hard argument for any Western leader to make. And those sanctions really stop Russia from being able to borrow on international markets, from being able to invest in its long-term growth. So we'll see Russia increasingly fall down as an economic power. It is still, however, able to trade. It's able to get its oil and gas out, and I'm happy to talk about why that's important to the West agenda. But I think one area where we've seen this is really important is, while countries like China are willing to buy up Russian commodities, oil, metals at a discount, they aren't willing to loan Russia new money to invest in its future economic growth. And so far, nobody has really been willing to offer that to Russia.
Quickly reacting to what you just said, Putin has just said that these are just sanctions. I'm quoting him. He's just said that it's just sanctions by the West. We have managed to achieve sustainability, and we have achieved financial system. So, you're right. The gas and the oil that we are talking about that keeps pumping out of Russia anyway, even despite all the sanctions, you briefly pointed it out that it actually serves the Western agenda as well. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yes, of course. Russia is one of the world's two largest oil producers. The major oil power, it's a major gas power as well. We've now seen Europe break its addiction to Russian gas, and actually gas prices are at 18-month lows, well below where they were even before Putin was beating the drumbeats of war at the end of 2021 and 2022. But for oil markets are really an incredibly globalized and international commodity where developments in supply and demand in one area will affect the market everywhere else. The West's concern is that if Russian oil stops pumping and stops getting exported, that will then cause oil prices to go to $150, potentially $200 a barrel, which will trigger recession everywhere from the U.S. to the U.K. to India, all countries dependent on oil imports. That would be a much worse scenario than even the 1973 Arab oil embargo that caused a previous spike in international oil prices over political disputes. So what the West strategy aims to do, and we see this in the oil price cap that came into effect last December, is to allow Russian oil to continue to flow out of the country, but for Russia to effectively receive a substantial discount on that. So international oil trades at around $80 a barrel, $75 a barrel right now, but Russia gets much less than that, around 50 to 45, because of the sanctions on it and the difficulty in exporting its oil. Largely, it's middlemen who profit, and countries like India and China end up paying close to the international price for the oil, but the Russian state itself receives less, while the West and international community are relatively isolated from the shocks of a potential oil price spike. Now, Putin may still seek to weaponize this at some point and to cut off his own oil supplies because he is willing to tank the Russian economy in pursuit of his war efforts. But I think for the West, it's very important to understand that the strategy is Russian oil should still get out onto international markets, but Russia should effectively receive substantial discounts for this. And we saw this comment directly. This isn't just my view. Janet Yellen, the U.S. Treasury Secretary, earlier in the month, she was on a tour of Africa, and she said very explicitly, we're happy with countries here buying up Russian oil at discounts. Our emphasis is that it's at a discount, not that the price doesn't, not that it doesn't get sold.
All right, Maximilian Hess, thank you so much for all your insights and staying with us, decoding actually in real time what Vladimir Putin is up to and what is the next game, so to say, of this as the second year of the Russian invasion starts on 24th of February. Thank you for all those insights.